Welcome, everybody, and thank you very much for coming. So Elmfield College, also known as the Connectional College, also known as Jubilee College, also known as Elmfield School, has had lots of names in its sort of 70-year history. Its 70-year history started in the 1860s and lasted till the 1930s. This is a drawing done from what is today the Malton Road in York, of its frontage facing north. What you can see is on the right-hand end is a house which was actually built in the 1840s. This is mirrored by another building at the left-hand end. Can you see my cursor okay? And then in the middle, we've got something which is about 60 feet high. That's about the height of an 8-story building today. So quite a big building, and it went out at the back as well. So I'm going to talk a bit about the house and a lot about the college. And thank you very much to Anglesey Brook for the encouragement to get this together. So that's Elmfield College. And there's actually a much later postcard of Elmfield College. At the left, you've got the same sort of frontage as we saw before. This shows at the right-hand side, you can see how far at the back it comes. So it goes about 100 yards at the back towards the sports fields. I want to particularly mention the physics laboratory. Elmfield was quite forward-looking in its dealing with science, and the sanatorium, which was built much later, 100 yards or so away from the school. So this is Elmfield towards the end of its days, around 1930. Now, so if we come back to the college, as I say, it's had many different pseudonyms, Jubilee College, Elmfield School, and so on. It was born in 1864, if I can put it like that, died in 1932, but it was revived from the dead twice in that period. It had 2 revivals from the dead in 1906 and 1929. And although it was called a college, well, I'm going to call it a college, it was really a Primitive Methodist secondary boarding school for boys, although it did have day boys as well. And the proportion of day boys increased as the years went on. But it's also the story of a house. And I've circled it in red there. So the house at the right of the picture we previously had. And here we have the view from the back. So there's the same house viewed from the back. And it's still recognizably the same house today. And in fact, there is a picture of the house today, taken from Google Earth or whatever it is. And then up at the right, we have what I've called their Mallinson house, which is where Joan, who is at this seminar this morning, now lives, which is now called 9 Straylands Grove, and that was built in the 1920s. So we've got 2 houses, both of which were called Headmaster's House, and the college itself was in the middle there and coming down over the street about 100 yards down towards the bottom of the picture there. Now, this is all to the northeast of the centre of York. So if you want to locate it geographically, there is York. Sorry, there is York. This is before the college was built. Elmfield Villa is up there. And this is the turnpike road to Malton, now called Malton Road. So it's about a mile from the Minster, northeast of the Minster. Elmfield Villa, which also had many different names, which became Elmfield College, which then became Elmfield House. Just a bit of local interest. There's a patchwork of parishes. The white areas there is one parish. The yellow areas is another parish, and the pink areas is a third parish. They're all sort of detached parts of the parishes belonging to churches in the centre of York. That's quite a common feature around York. It creates havoc when you're trying to look at censuses or anything which is based upon parishes. But that's by the by. So this is the story of a house that became a college and then became a house again. It was a house that was built in about 1840, became a college in the 1860s, and then in the 1930s, it became a house again. And so I'm calling it 5 phases. Phase 1 is before the college, starting in 1840. Then there's phase 2, which I've broken into 2A, 2B, and 2C, which I'll come back to in a moment. And then there's phase 3, which is after the college, from 1932 up till this year and onwards, we hope. Phase 2, I've broken into 3 sub-phases. This is essentially to do with who was in charge. For the first period, phase 2A, the Primitive Methodist Connection was in charge. In other words, it was sort of owned by the church, by the Primitive Methodist Church. That went on to 1906. Then there was a crisis. The Connection tried to close the college, but the old boys came along and said, oh, no, you don't. We want to keep it going. So the old boys basically bought it from the Connection. And we had another 23 years of life. And then Methodist Union was coming about, and it was taken over essentially by the Wesleyans in 1929 for the last 3 years. And the Wesleyans were instrumental in closing it down, and they merged it with the Wesleyan institution. And I think that reflected other features of the merger in the late 1920s that the Wesleyans basically took over. Tim might have some comments on that. That might not be a completely fair comment. So we've got these 5 phases, and there's 4 transitions. And actually, I think the transitions are the interesting part. And I'm going to focus mainly on the transitions and not on the sort of normal periods when things were not changing quite so much. Transformation phases in history, often the most interesting. They reflect crises, changing paradigms. And Thomas Kuhn, of course, has dealt with this in his books on scientific revolutions. And I suppose it goes back to Karl Marx and earlier, the idea of there being tensions and dialectical forces as the things that lead to change. I'm going to concentrate on the transitions and the tensions that led to them. The 4 transitions in detail. The first transition is the coming of the college. Where did the college come from? The second transition is when there was a crisis in the Connection and the old boys came to the rescue. The third one is when the Wesleyans take over. And the fourth one was when the college finally closed with a coup de grace from the Wesleyans. And of course, phase 3, which started in 1932, is now nearly a century old. It doesn't mean the end of the crises. There are still tensions. And then at the end of the talk, I'm going to give a few counterfactuals. What would have happened if the Wesleyans hadn't taken over, for example. So let me go briefly through these transition phases and ask the question of what dialectical forces, what tensions led to the change at that particular phase. So in 1864, the college was established. What were the tensions, the forces that led to the college being established? Well, I've listed a few here. The Prims were increasingly becoming affluent and gentrified. The 1860 Jubilee was the 50th anniversary of their founding. So they wanted to celebrate that in some way. And there were discussions, shall we do something to do with education, or shall we help the orphanage, or shall we send it on our missions to Africa? Those seem to be the 3 main contenders. The third reason was that because they're itinerant preachers, this jeopardized their children's education. Something had to be done about that. And initially, it was talked about as boys and girls, although in the event, Elmfield turned out to be just a boys' institution. There was the fear that children are leaving the Connection, and so to keep them in a Primitive Methodist college would sort of restrain them on the true and narrow way. There's a person called Samuel Ancliffe, the founder of Elmfield, who put a massive amount of energy into it. And there must have been local support from York, although actually the links between the college and York institutionally don't seem to have been very strong, but individually they were. And Alderman Meek is a feature that comes up. So the name Ancliffe and Meek arises there. So that's the first transition. Those were the forces that led to the college coming in my sort of overall summary. The second transition, in 1906, there was a crisis. Why did that happen? Well, roles were falling. There were problems with what was called dual management. It was initially set up, there was a governor who was responsible for the spiritual well-being of the boys, but there was the headmaster who was responsible for curriculum. That led to some problems. The Prims were losing membership nationally. There was increasing competition from state education. The Connection was having financial problems. There was possibly lobbying for new premises for the orphanage. So the orphanage came in. The takeover was there was a very active and affluent National Old Boys Association. And again, individuals played a role. The name Hartley cropped up a lot. These are the Hartley people who made jam, I think based in Dundee. But Cephas Hartley was a prominent member of the Old Boys Association. And the importance of the Old Boys is one of the rather unique things about the history of Elmfield College, I think. If we look at the next one, How did the Wesleyans take over? Well, things have been rather the same for 20 years, the same headmaster. The building and the staff were getting old. There was a rather critical report from a state inspectorate. Roles were falling. Some of the people who had funded it, Dyson Mallinson, who was a cotton entrepreneur, had lost their fortunes in the slump. There was increasingly state monitoring of schools, and of course competition from state schools. And nationally, there was moves towards Methodist Union and domination by Wesleyans. And again, individuals played a role. And here, Herbert Brooke Workman was a crucial person. So that was the sort of the penultimate crisis. And the final crisis was just 3 years later. The Wesleyans decided to close it. There was still instability. They'd appointed a new headmaster, but the staff was possibly poor. Elmfield was rather starved of funds in favour of Wesleyan schools. But more importantly, I think there was a deal worked out which benefited the Wesleyans in London, benefited Lanchester, which was Ashfield College in Harrogate, and also Newbold Kay was a Wesleyan solicitor and property speculator, and he became influential in the college, and he ended up buying the college and demolishing it and selling off the land individually over the period of the next 20 years. So I'm going to talk now just very briefly about the pre-college and the post-college, phase 1 and phase 3, just extremely briefly. The first mention of the house is 1842, when Stephen Thomas was declared bankrupt. Stephen Thomas of Lancelot Cottage. Now, Lancelot Cottage, from other evidence, I know is just another name for what was more usually called Elmfield Villa. So that's the first mention of it. And then over the next 20 years, there were 5, I don't know whether they all owned it, but they all certainly lived there. There was a doctor, there was a professor of music, there was a clergyman, and there was a solicitor. All of those are quite interesting individually. And when I give this talk in York in a few months' time, I'm going to spend more time on the sort of history of these local families. But that's the period before the college was there, from 1840 to 1862. And after the college, well, this is a map of the plots of land after the college had been demolished. It shows in 2, it shows the 1840s house still there in what is here called plot 6, is the new headmaster's house. And as you can see, there's plots going down there, and they go down for a further 100 yards or so. Today, there's well over 100 houses there. And it was sold by Kay to various other groups that always included Kay for £1,200 was what it was cost way back in the 1930s. Now, what's happened? Why? So this is Robert Newbold Kay, who basically sort of took over the house and the land after the college ceased. So very briefly now, these are the transactions that took place after the college. There's a history of bankruptcy. People seem to have bought it and gone bankrupt, stayed a very short period, went through these families, the Kays, the Boffs, the Watsons, the Pontefracts, the Bowens. Amazingly, even 30 years after the college had died, the old boys were still meeting regularly, and this was their centenary dinner. So the college was no longer there, but the old boys were. The chair was Sir Malcolm Stoddart Scott, who was one of the old boys who was an MP. I think there were 3 or 4 old boys who were MPs, including Ben Spoor, the left-wing Labour MP. He was an old boy of the college. And then as we come nearer the close, it was sold in 1971. It was then sold again in 1983 to Austin Hayes, who turned the house into an art gallery. So it was an art gallery for several years. And then he sold it to a family called Astle, and they sold it to us. And we've been there since 1989. So I think I'm right in saying that apart from the college, we are the longest inhabitants of the house in the nearly 200 years history. We've been there for 35 years. And now we're today, and here on the right, you see a history class looking at the world in many different ways, which I thought sort of summarized the confusion of an amateur historian such as myself. Everything's a bit upside down. 2024, on to the future, we're still living in history. Now I'm going to go back to the transitions, starting with the first transition, the transition from pre-college to the college. These were the points I mentioned before about the tensions that led to the college being established. And these are two of the key players, Samuel Antcliffe on the right, who is the key player, I suppose, and James Meek, a local person in York, who seems to play the key role as well. This is an account of the foundation stone being laid. And it's interesting in local newspapers then, how it gave very detailed architectural details. It gave details of who had been appointed to do the work. The builder was Weatherly, who was the city sheriff. Very close links between the business and the corporation then, of course. And there was a time capsule was placed in a mahogany box, placed in a cavity in the stone. So we don't know what happened to that. And John Petty was a crucial person in the early few years and the first governor, although he died after about 4 years. So this is James Meek, who laid the cornerstone. Accommodation was originally for 30 schoolboys, scholars. Then it was increased, and then it was increased up to 100. This is, I think, the earliest photo I have, and Tim will be speaking about this. Theological students. For about 3 years, the college was also the centre of the training for boys in the ministry. And so this is after John Petty has died. Thomas Smith was the governor. And this must be when the building behind was only about 3 or 4 years old. I'm afraid I don't really know who the people there are other than Thomas Smith. Slightly later in the same period, there are some medals were awarded. I don't know anything about the history of these, except people write to me occasionally to say, my grandfather was at the college and I've got this or that. And these were 2 medals awarded in the 1870s for good performance, I suppose. This was the certificate on which was the image that I started the talk with, issued to a very interesting family called Barker, who were also potters that I'm now in touch with again. Round about the same period, there's an old boys reunion. Now, those of you who know the house, and several of you do, might recognize this as still the way in to the downstairs kitchen. This is the kitchen window. This is now the door into what has now got a conservatory on. And so there we've got an old boys reunion. This is soon after the old boys organization was established in the 1880s. There we've got another photo. I don't know anything about this photo, but it's the same location, the same doorway, the same kitchen window, the same window which now leads to a conservatory. I don't really know anything about this. I'm sure these are not the boys of the college. There must have been a visit to the college from somewhere else. This is taken by a photographer in Kirby Moorside. So were these Primitive Methodists from Kirby Moorside who had a day out in York? I don't really know. But the same location as the previous one. And there's a third picture of the same location. And yes, so let me now move on to the next transition. Again, I've briefly gone over this, the things that led to the old boys taking over. Roles were falling and there were problems with dual management. I'll go through that a bit more quickly, but first a couple of images of around the same time. So a football team, we played football and rugby and did quite well in both. And in some of the teams, the masters played along with the boys. Around the same time, that is just before the second transition, a new chapel was built about a mile away, largely for the boys to save them having to walk to the previous chapel, which is much further away. And this is one of the foundation stones. And this was the wife of the headmaster, who also laid a foundation stone. And this was the John Petty Memorial Chapel, which is just outside the city walls, leading out towards where Elmfield is. And the boys used to march there every Sunday, twice apparently. I've got quite a few interesting contemporaneous accounts. Probably I won't read the letters now, but there's quite a few nice accounts of boys writing home, talking about their life at Elmfield. This is a description of the opening of this. They call the building a free treatment of the Romanesque style. Ruabon bricks, I don't know what they are, an ornament to Monkgate. It's had space for 750 people. It's recently been on the market for £500,000. And this was when the soon after the John Petty Memorial Chapel had been opened, a previous governor died, and this is a picture of a very fine funeral procession approaching the chapel on Monkgate, having perhaps started from the college. I don't know about that. This is a Christmas card the same year. At the top it says Elmfield College. Hand drawn, I think, or was it mass produced? I don't know. Perhaps individually drawn. I don't know. Another medal of about the same period. And then when the connectional institution closed down the college, the system of dual control ended. So there was no longer the governors. These were the governors who had been there, starting with John Petty. So there had been, 8 governors in a period of about 40 years. Continual tensions. They were generally old, esteemed men who didn't last very long in the post, and there was often conflict with the heads who were considerably younger. Yeah, 2 of the heads actually married daughters of the governors, so there was some relationship between them and the heads. But the changeover in 1906 led to the end of the system of dual control. So the connection wanted to close down the college, and they offered it to the orphanage, who considered it, but they decided it was quite unsuitable for the purposes of the orphanage, especially as it would have meant a return to the old barrack system, now so much condemned. So the barrack system was not good enough for the orphanage, but it was good enough for Elmfield College. So the boys still lived in the barrack system. I think that means the dormitory system rather than individual rooms, but I don't really know. Yeah, and so that's a newspaper report of the same thing, really. But along came Cephas Hartley and the old boys, Floreat Elmfield. The future will outshine the past. Elmfield is a name written in the hearts of many of the most distinguished ministers and laymen. And so it goes on in very florid language. Key in this was this cotton broker, Dyson Mallison, who was very wealthy himself, but he obviously had a good way of bullying his friends to provide funding. So he said to each of the other 29 directors, either find a new boy who will come and fund the school as a fee-paying scholar, or give the school £5. And the school was a commercial investment. It was a sure 5% investment. Dyson Mallison was warmly cheered. People put in their money. They didn't actually get their 5%, but they got some money back for their investment in the college. Dividends were provided. Here's an early advert in which it says how the boys went up very successfully from 18 in 1907 to 53 only even a few months later. And here's the commercial announcement about the college and the issue of shares. Around the same time in York, there's a very important by-election. That's another story, I won't go into that. And so we jump quite quickly from 1906 to the Golden Jubilee of Elmfield. In 1914, it was 50 years after the college was founded. Excuse me while I just take a little bit of water. So there was a big Jubilee get-together. Now, unfortunately, the timing was not very good. It was just before the Archbishop was murdered in Sarajevo, and within a few weeks of this, the First World War had broken out, which, of course, affected the school in many ways. One particular way was this old boy, Graham Price, who was a dispatch rider, and he wrote for the Elmfieldian, which was the college newspaper, and he gave a sort of a bystander's report of the famous Christmas truce in 1914. there's been more or less a truce between our men and the Germans. Our fellows started singing carols, and the Germans then sang one of their own. And two of the Germans got up and they shouted, "Come and drink their health." And so we went and we met and we got on with them jolly well for a couple of days. The truce lasted for 3 days, but it all ended at 12 a.m. last night. I think that means midnight. And then he says, by the way, I went to the general headquarters and stayed the night, slept in a real bed the first time for about 10 weeks. And he comments on things in the Elmfieldian, one or two editorial blunders. Now, I think this was his last letter home because he was then killed quite soon after this. So a sad but revealing commentary from an old boy of Elmfield. The war was memorialized, and is memorialized particularly by this clock at the going down of the sun, and in the morning we will remember them, and the names of the boys who died. I think something like 35 old boys died in the First World War, and a couple died who actually are not on that list. There was also this medal that I've only seen online. I don't know too much about it, but this is inscribed Elmfield College as a memorial. Now, about the same time, there were further building developments. This was the schoolroom, looking very austere, issued as a postcard. There was a series of postcards, which I think was done for quite a lot of schools around that time. So now moving quickly on, and I apologize about the speed. I'm jumping now up to the end of the 1920s when the Wesleyans take over. The buildings have been there for 20 years. Dyson Malleson and other benefactors had lost their fortunes in the slump. There was competition from the state, but particularly there were general national moves towards Methodist Union and domination by the Wesleyans increasingly, and Herbert Workman of the Wesleyan Secondary School Trust took over, and commercially the ownership transferred from the old boys to the Wesleyan Secondary School Trust. Now, leading up to that, it had been thriving. So this transition there was 1929. A few years earlier, things had been thriving. The school was full in 1920. Extensions were being built. Mr. Slack, the headmaster, had taken groups around the battlefields of the Western Front. The war was over by then, of course. Also, an interesting comment on the bonfire at the end of 1920. Ex-army flares doubled up because they couldn't get any fireworks. Adequately made up for the lack of pyrotechnics. 1921, big changes, 2 new dormitories. Cricket field was purchased. It had been rented up to that time, I think purchased from St. Peter's School in York. A new house was built for the headmaster. This is the one I referred to earlier, now known as Mallinson House. Elmfield became grant aided, which meant it got some money from the state, but no further dividends could be paid. Dyson Mallinson got a knighthood. And on Whit Monday, they had a sports day, slow bicycle race, dribbling football race, a boot race, a flower pot race, an old boys race, and a little girls race. Now, I recall some things like that at school events when I was a child, but not all of them. I'm not quite sure what a boot race was, but one can imagine, perhaps. So that was 1921, a few years before the crisis that led to the Wesleyans taking over. The school was still thriving. In 1921 to 2, there are 160 boys on the register, the highest ever. They were fundraising for the 60th anniversary of the school and a new cricket pavilion in memory of those who died during the war. Mr. Slack, the headmaster in 1925, became the sheriff of York, and Newbold Kay, who eventually purchased the buildings, was the Lord Mayor. So there was obviously a close relationship between the school and the city, at least as far as individuals were concerned. The school was also very active in the golf club, which was just over the road conveniently. Here's a part picture of the staff and boys in 1922. This is actually one of these wide panoramic pictures. I've just taken a photo from the middle And this is Stanley Slack, the headmaster, and these presumably are the masters, and the boys are there. The Elmfieldian celebrated its 60th anniversary, or celebrated the 60th anniversary of the school, I should say. The logo, quite interesting, nice and simple. Just presumably that's a Y and not a wine glass. And the York Road and EC. Very simple logo, really. So in 1924, Kay and Slack were the Lord Mayor and Sheriff of York, and the new cricket pavilion was built, and it listed again the old boys who fell during the Great War. 1927, signs of trouble. Enrollment was falling. Dyson Mallison had lost his fortune. The conference was becoming a bit anxious about the religious side of the college. They were a bit worried about the whether the spiritual well-being of the boys was being dealt with commensurately with their academic thriving. And I think academically they were thriving. But it was transferred to the Wesleyan Methodist Secondary School Trust, and this statement was made to Elmfield belongs the honour of being the first institution to join up with other Methodist schools in fulfilment of the spirit of Methodist Union. So 28-29, a year of considerable anxiety due to the industrial depression. End of 29, a new headmaster was appointed, H.D. Anthony, a scholar of repute, outstanding qualifications, but a rather weak staff, according to Bill Booth, who's one of the early historians. Dyson Mallison, who'd lost all his money, resigned following the cotton slump. Here's a couple of pictures of around the same sort of time. I don't quite know, this is a Blazer badge, I suppose. I've only seen one copy of it when I interviewed an old boy well into his 90s about 20 years ago. Yeah, I took that picture. I think that's where that came from. Now, the final transition was when the college finally closed. I think basically the new headmaster wasn't given a chance. There was some bad feelings because they'd been promised at least 3 years and they got less than 3 years. And basically, I think there was a hurry to close it and to transfer the boys and the assets to Elmfield College which is a Wesleyan college in Harrogate. And so this is Newbold K and the same plot that I'd shown you before. And so now I just want to end up with the same, looking at history with many different angles, common themes that I think seem to have come up throughout this history. Firstly, Methodism. Both versions of Methodism started in revolt against the sort of aristocratic pretensions of the dominant church at the time. But then they themselves became gentrified. The Wesleyans became gentrified, which led to the creation of the Primitives. And then the Primitives themselves became gentrified, and they wanted better education for their kids and so on. Another fear was of sheep going astray, children leaving the flock. And so it was a way of restraining them in. There were, of course, tensions between the Wesleyans and the Prims, and there were tensions between Methodists and Anglicans. And there were then, later on, educational tensions between the state and the church. Another thing which I've sort of only become recently aware of is the concentrations of power. And there's a big contrast between, in 1864, the funding came from many small contributions. People up and down the country put in £5, £1, £10 into the Jubilee Fund. And this went to found Elmfield. So lots of small people put their money in, but in the end, it went to one property speculator who was an influential person in the church. So there are concentrations of power there as quite a common theme. And I think that just about brings me to the end. I'm sorry if I've rambled rather, but I'll be very interested. Oh, sorry, a couple of counterfactuals. What would have happened if Elmfield had become an orphanage? Would the building still be there? Would it have been converted into an orphanage? What would then have happened? I don't know. What if Elmfield had remained in Heworth and not moved to Harrogate? Perhaps it would have remained as a school, possibly not. But perhaps the buildings would at least have been retained. And perhaps they would have been turned into some luxury flats by now. It would look a bit incongruous in today's Heworth, being quite a long way out of York, well, a mile out of York. But is that what would have happened if Elmfield had remained in Heworth and if the buildings had not been demolished? Who knows? We live in living history. Who knows about the future? But I hope I've introduced some interesting ideas there about the past. Very much a personal journey. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing any comments. Thank you.
So thank you. That was a wonderful talk, which is being echoed by everybody around. Just one thing that I'd like to add, and we've discussed this, is I think Elmfield College is very important as a milestone in Primitive Methodist history, because the foundation of the college as a school, a secondary school, also provided the Primitive Methodists finally with the excuse or the context in which to establish their first ministerial training college. I mean, as you can imagine, the first 50 years, there was a lot of resistance in Primitive Methodism, something that we hear frequently, even today. You send theologically minded people off to college and they're spoilt. And so there was this fear amongst the Primitive Methodists that those who were really primarily called to be evangelists were being sent off to college and would come out very different sorts of ministers. And that was not just for the Primitive Methodists. Early Wesleyan Methodists had that resistance to theological education. So the decision of the 1865 conference to put some ministerial training students into Elmfield, now 4 years as a school, that was very important, because I think that meant that there was that excuse to establish ministerial education within Primitive Methodism. When the history of the college first came to be recorded in a book called The Story of Our Colleges, and these were all the theological colleges of the three strands of Methodism, published by Bardsley Brash, there was a chapter on the Hartley Primitive Methodist College, Hartley being in Manchester. And there was a sentence that really bristled with me, but in fact said it all. It could be claimed that the story of Hartley College is virtually the history of ministerial education in the Primitive Methodist Church. Well, of course, that was patently not so, and it's written from a Wesleyan perspective, and a very Northern Manchester perspective as well, because what Elmfield demonstrates is that there was theological education established out of the ministerial associations that were there in the 1850s, a growing not only affluence amongst Primitive Methodists, which enabled colleges and schools to be built and supported, but also a desire for a more professional ministry. This has been demonstrated in a book by Brown across all the denominations. The Primitive Methodists came to it very late in the day. And so, the first theological education was at Elmfield. And I really think that it only moved from Elmfield because of two things. First of all, John Petty, who was tasked with the impossible task of being both in charge of the theological college, but also being headmaster of the school. And that just didn't work. In fact, it killed him. And I think at that stage, though they decided that they couldn't hold the two together. And it was at that stage that William and Samuel Ancliffe, who had both been involved with Elmfield, persuaded the connection to move the institution to Sunderland, which was a power base of northeastern Primitive Methodism. So another institution was set up there. And then subsequently a further institution established in Manchester, which had close connections with Owens College in Manchester, so had strong academic links. And it's only because of the jam money again, Sir William Hartley, that Manchester eventually wins out over Sunderland to be the Primitive Methodist College because of all the money that he channeled into it. So I think Elmfield College deserves to be recognised as a pioneer in theological education in Primitive Methodism, and that's very important to recognise.